All right, everybody, what's happening? My name is Tim Desilets. I'm the Director of Student Ministries at Hope Community Church in King of Prussia, and I'm here today with my friend Adam McLane from Praying Pelican Missions. Adam, you want to share just a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, as Tim said, my name is Adam McLane. I'm the Director of Development at Praying Pelican Missions. Prior to that, I spent about a career in the youth ministry world. Many of you might know me from Youth Specialties, and then I spent the last about 8 or 9 years at the Youth Cartel and made the transition over to PPM last summer. So yeah, happy to be here.
In the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah, it's a perfect time. Yeah.
Nothing like changing a job. And one of the things I think we're talking about today, Adam, is just talking about that you and I believe that this is the time to make some changes like that. And this is not a time to wait around and wait for things to go back to normal and then pull the rug out from everybody and make changes. I know for me, I've been on many student mission trips. I've traveled both locally with groups like the Philadelphia Project and some other opportunities here in Philly. I've traveled regionally. I run kind of my own little program in Vermont in the summers. I've done stuff with organizations like YouthWorks through the Appalachia area in the South, and I've done things internationally. And I've spent a lot of time in Haiti with Praying Pelican Missions, and most recently, I've taken just a week and a half ago, I spent some time in Ensenada, Mexico with Adam. And I think one of our goals today is to kind of talk about what the future of student missions is. And all that to say, I think we really want to talk about student missions not just being a something you do, but being a strategy, not just for your youth, but for your whole church, and how that kind of plays into things like long-term partnerships and stuff like that. And so we've got we're going to start with a first question today, kind of like if we were starting from scratch. We're starting with a brand new ministry and taking a first-time trip. What would we suggest for a strategy? I think we've talked that the pandemic has caused a major disruption in the way we do things. And if we were to poll any youth pastors listening today, or any youth pastors who are going to watch this later, my guess is that you didn't travel where you were planning to do last summer, or last spring break, or last whenever you take your trip, Christmas time, or whenever it is. Most of you take at least a trip a year, or a trip every 2 years, or whatever it is. You didn't do it last year, and you're likely not doing it this summer. And so as you look forward to the next year, what's that going to look like? And rather than default to what you've always done in the past, it might be time to consider something new. And so, Adam, going back to that question, brand new ministry, first time trip, how would you suggest someone forming a strategy?
Well, first of all, I think it's an important thing to include in your actual philosophy of ministry as a whole. So when you think about your student ministry, where does missions fit into that? I know as a parent of high schoolers, as a former youth pastor, I feel like I have a responsibility to give those cross-cultural experiences to my students as part of their faith formation, not as something accidental or something that's just opportunistic, but as a real part of your strategy of what are we trying to do? We're trying to develop lifelong Christians, not just for our own church, but because those kids are going to go to college, they're going to have other experiences in life. But what are the experiences you can give them when they're really malleable in middle school and high school? And you can do that with a short-term mission trip. We know that works. And like you mentioned, I've as a youth pastor, I've led everything from trips that I did on my own through some friends and partnerships. I remember doing that in Chicago for a number of years, had great ministry. But really the best ones were with organizations that really knew what they were doing and were willing to work with us and fit a trip into our overall ministry strategy. So I think that's the most important part, is when you sit down and think about your philosophy of youth ministry, where does it fit into the whole scheme of what you're trying to do? Like in your ministry, you guys really focus on that senior trip, so you have the service projects that are available to every student every year, but then that international trip becomes something like you're taking your most experienced / your most committed students on a really impactful, as almost like it's a capstone of their high school ministry experience. And so what's awesome about that is it fits into your strategy. And that's why it works. And that's why you see the results that you do. Where we see teams that really struggle is when they just sign up for a trip because they got a postcard, they didn't do any preparation, they literally just showed up on the mission trip, and then they're disappointed because they didn't get the outcomes that they were kind of hoping for, both because they never articulated them to the organization in advance, but also because they didn't do the years of prep work that were necessary to get the results that they were looking for.
Yeah, we've often called that the dartboard approach. You put a whole bunch of locations or options for where you might want to travel with your teens, and maybe you even let them pick. Or maybe you're sitting in your office and you've got those all on the spinning dartboard, and you spin it and you throw it, and Jamaica this year, let's go. And I think there's just a lot of danger that can happen with that yes, it's important that students have input, and yes, it's important that they can look forward to something. But I think a lot of people are afraid of the repetitive nature of like, well, we can't go to the same place every year. Our students need a rural experience. They need a urban experience. They need a international experience. They need a reservation experience. And we're trying to provide them this broad net. And I think in that strategy, it's important to realize the importance of like faithful, repetitive nature of doing stuff. I know for us, and going to Southern Vermont every summer, our 7th grade completed to our seniors completed go to Southern Vermont every year. And it's important for us that they have created and found an identity somewhere that's not home. And honestly, somewhere where mom and dad are not, because that's what we're expecting them to do in college. And that's what we want them to do in the future. And so as we look at international trips, it may not be easy to take the same group of kids on the same international trip every single year. And so, Adam, how does that fit in with Praying Pelican's strategy of long-term partnerships?
Yeah, so I mean, the whole thing, it's all about long-term partnerships in our world. So right now, just to give you a frame of reference, we have about 450 what we call church partners, so different churches that we work with and ministry partners across a whole bunch of different countries, and a lot in the domestic here in the United States. And those are churches that we have long-term relationships with, meaning we've worked with them over a number of years, but the ideal situation that we see is when a church in the U.S., so like let's say a church from King of Prussia comes and works with the same church over and over again in a place like Ensenada, or previously you guys were in Haiti. The relationship gets better, the ministry gets better, and the outcomes that you receive on the flip side, it's like what are kids taking home gets stronger and stronger and stronger, because as those churches get to know you, it allows them to better prepare for your team to come. And so, it's cool when you go back to a location on your mission trip and you see, hey, there's pictures on the wall from last year when we were here. And then, you run into the people of the church are saying, hey, we've been praying for that kid that was here last year. What's going on with her? How's she doing in college? Those kinds of things. Those like long-term relationships become more and more meaningful, and it gives opportunities for the ministry to flow both ways. And that's where we see the real explosion in people's faith formation. The United States is so ethnocentric. And so it's really important to get people out of where they live to take them somewhere else. And that could be, if you're in Philly and you go to Appalachia for a mission trip, that's so important for kids to get to know that, hey, there are people who live in different places around the United States that think differently, that speak differently, that talk about Jesus a little bit differently. That's so important. And that's because it becomes part of them becoming part of the larger church community as they turn into adults.
Yeah, that capstone experience you were talking about earlier that is so important to us is really that final piece for us with my high school juniors and seniors to say, hey, God isn't just working here in your little world in King of Prussia or the little world that we work in Vermont. He's working internationally, globally, and working in different ways. And you may not believe, you may not understand how someone in Haiti living in such poverty could possibly be so happy. But if that little thing rocks your world, or the church that we were with Adam in Ensenada this past weekend that fasted as a church so they could provide food to donate to someone needy in their community, man, that rocked my world. Yeah. And made me think about the groceries that I buy this week and what am I doing with that, and looking forward to donating something monthly to the grocery ministry at that church to double with what are they able to provide. And when a student can get that in their head and understand that mentality at the ripe age of 17, 18, they're going to go so far in life. Not to mention the adults that get to come along with. I've seen so many adults get their worlds rocked right alongside the kids, and that's even more exciting. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, how humbling was that to sit there and the pastor's explaining, hey, every month, the first Sunday of every month, we fast so that we can donate food here in the community to people in need. And I'm thinking, here's people who make $10 a day, literally, and they're trying to feed a family on their own, and yet they're quite literally bringing offerings and putting food on the table of the church to donate. I was like, wow, that just kind of blew my mind.
Yeah, lady brought up like the toothpaste and the toothbrush, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like slay me now. Here's my wallet. But the wallet isn't necessarily the answer, right? And there's, we've talked a lot about that. We could probably go a whole nother direction with that today, but. So you've decided maybe that, it's time to come up with a strategy. And you're like, okay, maybe I do need to find one location and really kind of link into kind of one spot. But your church for the last 10, 15, 35 years has been doing that kind of dartboard approach or the multiple experiences, and our kids need all these things. What language would we use to kind of help change and twist that around, that it's time for maybe a new way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of a long-term partnership is not that strange for churches. I grew up in churches that had missionaries on the wall, right? That they came every 4 years when they were on furlough and they did their presentation, or maybe your church had that annual missions conference in October where they brought all the missionaries back. So, I mean, that might actually be the first place to start, to be perfectly frank with you. It might not be with an organization like PPM. It might be, hey, look, we've been supporting this missionary in Guatemala for the last 15 years, and this is this family, and they came from the church. It could be figuring out how do we logistically go on a mission trip with our students somewhere like there. And that's certainly a place where, I mean, if you look at the history of PPM, that's how we've gotten into some countries that we're serving is, people who are already going on trips with us said, hey, we have these awesome partnerships, but the missionary, they just don't know how to do a short-term trip. They can't handle the logistics of picking up 20 people and housing them and all the other stuff. They have the ministry squared away. So we literally could be starting with the people that are already on board at your church as missionaries and figuring out, would it make sense to logistically start saying, let's partner with them better? Yeah, we're giving them money every month, but would it be important to them to receive a team so maybe they could advance something that's in their the vision for their ministry? But I think that's the real conversation. You talk about changing the language is saying, how do we do something that's more long-term? I think the beef that's been out there with short-term missions forever, the reason why books like When Helping Hurts were written is because, a youth group would show up, they would build something, they would never engage with the family really, they would never engage with the local church, they would take the picture at the end of the thing. Kids' lives were impacted, and then they would peace out and they would never go back to that location ever again. They would never know what happened to that house, or they would never know, how did did that family know Jesus? Did they trust Jesus with their life? Did they advance in their relationship with Jesus because of the house? Because it wasn't a long-term strategy, it really became almost like a form of tourism where you were taking kids to have these experiences. And then sure, it'd be a great experience, but it wouldn't be that longitudinal look. The best youth ministry that's out there has a longitudinal look. That's why staying in the same church for 5, 10, 15 years is so important, because you start seeing those families that, you had that kid in youth group and then they go to college and they come back and they get a job in the community and then they get married and they have those kids. That's when your ministry is really, really, really doing amazing things, when people see you for 5 or 10 years. And it's the same thing with your short-term missions. When it starts to do that, then incredible things happen in your congregation. In those kinds of relationships. So it's a little bit of vision casting of saying what is possible and how can short-term missions help our church, but also each individual person who goes, but also how can we have a long-term impact so that our dollars aren't just blown away on things. So when people think about like, hey, we're spending $25,000 or $30,000 on airfare and these trips and so on and so forth, are we making an impact? Why don't we just send the $25,000 or $30,000? There's
Right.
always that pushback that happens. But when a ministry can see that long-term impact, and you start thinking about what is $25,000 or $30,000 versus a new soundboard, or versus swapping out all the tech in the church or whatever, it really becomes a powerful part of a church's ministry as a whole.
Yeah, you touched on a couple things there. One, I want to kind of circle back to we actually had that happen with a kind of a connection of ours in Haiti, a pastor that had been supported not by our whole church, but by some people in the church. And we made that introduction with PPM to this pastor, and PPM ended up helping us facilitate trips to that location and that pastor. I think 7 to 8 different trips before logistically Haiti became not accessible for us. Yeah. But that was a really, really neat thing for us, because we wouldn't have been able to do that without another organization stepping in for those safety logistics and food logistics and all the things that happened there. We've been hitting all around relational ministry, and I know it's not one of our good topic questions here, but in terms of strategy goes, you want to touch a little bit on building, like the goal of going to build something physical versus the goal to build something relational? I know you kind of hit on it briefly there, but that's kind of one of the old ways too that I'd like to shift people's thinking to the new way as well.
Yeah, I mean, so there's certainly value in building things. There's nothing. I mean, if you think about just American culture, there's nothing more American than going and building something in a week. But if you think about the construction that happens in your community, how would you feel about a house that got built in a week, right? You would feel kind of weird about that. You would be like, I don't know if those high school kids are really like designed, or they're not trained to do that kind of work. And so it's kind of a different way that we like to approach it is when we certainly have churches and partners that need things, right? So we have churches that like right now I'm getting ready to go work with a church in the end of May that they're rebuilding their church. Their church was effectively crumbling, and they're going through a several-year process of completely rebuilding their church from the ground up. And so when we have teams come, they're not going to finish a project in a week. They're not going to, construct a brand new steel building that's going to last 100 years in a week. But they can certainly contribute to it, and they can see some impact. But where we see the best thing that happens when it comes to construction and building on mission trips is when we partner with locals. And so in every place around the world, there's not a labor shortage. They don't need to import teenagers to build things. Instead, what we can say is, why doesn't this trip come and we provide the dollars for the materials, and let's go hire local labor. And let's introduce that local labor to the pastor so that there's a relationship that's going to last. And so what we see oftentimes is we bring in skilled labor to do skilled labor tasks. And we use our volunteers that come from the United States for unskilled labor. And so I feel so much more comfortable having teenagers move materials and concrete block and, cement, mix the cement and things like that. But look, professionals who need the work benefit from a ministry coming for a week. I remember I was in Haiti before I worked on staff there. It was like 6 or 7 years ago. We were driving around and visiting teams in a particular busy time in the summer. And I said, Jim, how many people is PPM employing this week? And he had no idea. So we sat down with a little scratch of paper. And just that 1 week with 13 teams, we were employing 500 people full time that week. Wow. That's like powerful ministry. That's right. Good news in the neighborhood. Because those are 500 people who are going home and feeding their families, and they're thinking about how can I grow my business, and that's the gospel flowing into those communities, and that's the ministry that we want to see. Bringing in cheap labor from the United States doesn't really make any sense. I've certainly had teenagers. Maybe 2 months ago, I was on a trip with a kid from Tucson. His dad owned a construction company, and boy, that guy he framed out some things, but he was professional. He knew what he was doing. But that's rare, right? Those are special kids. Most times we're bringing a kid that's never held a shovel before. So we have to be cognizant that it's an opportunity for us to hire locally, and to, build those relationships with those construction workers who have now benefited from one of our short-term trips. Those are things that you don't really think about when you're coming on a trip, but those are things that if you just stop and look and you go, wow, this trip, it was $25,000 or whatever, but look at all the good it did in the community. That's an important piece of that.
Yeah, I experienced that in Haiti as well. I think a couple of trips that I went on, just dawned on me the realization that my dollar that I spent was employing a cook. The food was purchased from a local person on the street, and the this and the that, and like it was just crazy. The list went on in terms of the people. There was somebody doing night watch for us, and there was somebody, and our leftover pieces from our meal went right back out into the neighborhood, and just really, really powerful stuff in terms of that long-term long-term impact, but also that relational impact that goes past just building something. Just real quick, and before we transition into both the negative and positive impact stuff, can you give a couple thoughts about relational projects that have been really, really great, not just ones that are tied to building projects, but for instance, the food ministry stuff that you and I have done in Ensenada, maybe tree planting in Haiti, that sort of stuff that maybe seem kind of out of the box, but might be things that people might want to consider as they adopt something more than just coming to do kids ministry and building a church or building a house.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and basically in all of our locations, we do some form of food distribution, or the tree ministry is actually part of a food distribution model. It's just a slow food distribution model. But yeah, so the idea that, so let's use the food one as an example. And so I think it was with your team 2 years ago, we were doing food distribution, and the people who get identified as recipient families, the church is identifying, hey, we know there's families in our community that have need. Just from an aid perspective, that is so important, because like I would have no idea the difference between somebody who's actually in need and somebody who just shows up for free food, right? And if your church runs a food pantry, you know that there's people who just go from free food spot to free food spot. Are they really in need? I don't know. But the church knows, like, if they've been working in that neighborhood for 20 years, they know, like, this rental house always has the poorest people in the community, or, this is a house that's rough. So I remember we went with Pastora Ceci, our pastor's wife, and she was like, yeah, I've been trying to reach this family for several years. And they were a neighbor of hers. They lived down like a block behind her and maybe 6 houses over. And she just got in a really rough, that never really got anywhere with them, and trying to invite them to church and share the gospel with them. And your team shows up, and they have...
We all went. I think all of us went.
Yeah, all of us went. We had gone to the store. We bought about $40 in groceries. And so like I shared before, in Mexico, that's about 4 days worth of wages. And so we show up with this abundant good news, right? Of yummy foods, things that they can't afford. And this is like Jesus pouring himself out to this family, and they receive it, and they're awkward about it, because somebody's just showing up with this, there's 14 white people show up on their front door, and it just feels weird. But we're just chatting with them and just, sharing, just sharing why we're there. We pray with them. They feel awkward about that. You can kind of tell. But then that Wednesday night, the family came to church. And so Pastora Ceci had been inviting them to church for years, and they'd never shown up. And because they received this gift, maybe out of some sense of obligation, right? So they received this big gift, and the random white people invited me to church. So ta-da, here I am. But on that Wednesday night, that family received Christ. And it was just like, it was so impactful, not just for your team, but to see the women of the church who had been visiting that family for years, for whatever reason, in God's abundant mercy, used your team to just put them over the edge. And that family came to church that night and received Christ. Stuff like that's powerful. It's not just powerful for your team, but it's powerful for the church that is hosting you, who's taken that risk and saying, yeah, we'll take 14 random white people into our community for a week, and we'll invest in them, and we'll love them, and we'll feed them. But that was something that they got out of that trip, and they got so excited, and spurred them on. And I remember at the end of the week, the pastor saying, yeah, I didn't know it, but like this group of women from the church, they're going to continue on doing what you're doing.
Right.
And they're going to continue doing the food ministry. They realized how, like, it wasn't that hard to show up at people's houses and invite them to church or just pray for them. And so those kinds of things continue on. They have a long-term effect for that local church. So,
well, that's the same church that's fasting now. Right. On Sundays to once a month to get that food, to get it out into the community. And so
so you see that long-term impact. It's so impressive. That church now has, I believe that they've broken their neighborhood up into 7 little areas, and they've assigned a committee to each area to reach into that particular part of the neighborhood. And that's all stuff that came flow directly out of a short-term mission trip experience for that church. And so that's the kind of impact that I think that people want to have. When you raise that, when you're thinking about the car washes and all the crap you got to go through as a youth pastor to make a mission trip happen, all the awkward conversations with parents who are a little bit concerned, that's why you do it. Right. Because you're going to make an impact there, but you're also going to make an impact on that teenager's life.
I think it sticks, that relational impact, that relational handshake that goes further than carrying that bucket of concrete or that bucket of rocks across the parking lot to hand it to somebody else. That's not to say you don't have a great picture of a building and ideally that something great happened in that building after you were gone. Yeah. But it's not tangible. It's not as it would appear that is actually more tangible than doing what we just talked about, but the relationship between those things, the pictures I took of my students praying over those families, and those other things are far more tangible. The guy that ended up breaking out his guitar, and the kids ran back to grab their guitar, and they ended up playing guitar with this guy they had delivered food to, and he came to church all sorts of just really. Even
think about the kids in your youth group who are now Instagram friends with the youth group kids from that church. That's pretty cool. And that, we talk about something that changes a culture, is you start hearing in your classes, and maybe your classmates are degrading and saying, hey, Mexican people do this and Mexican people do that. And you're like, all of a sudden that kid in your class from your youth group could raise their hand and say, actually, I went to Mexico. I'm still friends with people in Mexico. Why don't we ask them that question? So you can start dispelling cultural myths about different places that people go. And I call that stuff soft diplomacy. So your kids can go home. They're a little bit defensive when people are degrading to the places that they've been. They're like, no, that's not how all Mexicans are, or whatever. Cutting through those stereotypes, and that's all pretty powerful stuff from a relationship perspective. Hey,
we're at the midway point. We got maybe three questions left, but shout out to any folks watching. I know we're streaming live on the EPYC group. The Eastern Pennsylvania Youth Coalition group. I think we're streaming live over in Jersey with some of the Jersey youth pastors and a couple of the other groups that we interact with. But thanks for being here with us today. Feel free to throw questions in the chat, or feel free to reach out either to Adam and I after we're done, or hit me on text right now is fine too if we're friends. But hey, we just want to kind of turn the corner here. We want to talk about both negative and positive impacts. Jonathan, you want to throw that next question up? Can you give us some examples of successes from groups that have made this kind of switch, like some success stories of some groups that are due? We certainly talked about some of the things that happened with my group, but I'd love to hear some groups that have had that longer partnership. And some of PPM's dreams even about the reverse mission trip. And I know that's something you're passionate about as the director of development at PPM.
Yeah. So, I think of a story. There's a church here in Southern California, a Catholic church that we partnered with, a Pentecostal church in Ensenada. And just on the surface, what a crazy partnership, right? How is this going to work? We got people who, they go to a Catholic church, and I've been to many masses, and you think about the style of worship changes to a Pentecostal church where there's somebody over in the corner with a shofar and some people with whatever, there's a lot going on sometimes in the worship services that we're a part of. And so you just see it from a positive perspective. You see people who doctrinally don't get along, right? And so like on the surface, you would say, boy, theologically, a Catholic group and a Pentecostal group almost not even practicing the same faith, is what it feels like on paper. But in reality, what they had in common was they had this love for mercy ministry. And so you have we partner them with a pastor who he calls it a men's home, but it's a place for people who don't fit in anywhere else in the world. So maybe they're ex-cons, or maybe they're drug addicts, or maybe they did drugs to the point where they have long-term mental things where even the hospitals have given up and kicked them out and put them on the street. And they're people who literally would have just been homeless. And so this pastor has a ministry to them where he provides them a free place to live. And he provides all sorts of services that are not supported by the government, not supported by any financial means. It's just a straight up faith ministry. And so think about those positive relational things. Is here's a church coming from Orange County, California, one of the highest rent districts, right, in the United States, and just their hearts were broken, and they started saying like, well, how do we do life with the guys who live in this home? And one of the ways they did it is said, hey, stop making us breakfast, this amazing breakfast. We're going to take breakfast and go hang out with them. And so they would every morning, that group, this year will be their third trip down. Instead of having breakfast at their housing location, they take breakfast and they make breakfast with the guys. So they're cooking side by side. They sit down at picnic tables and they just share life with guys that for the most part, nobody would talk to. Like these, you're talking to a guy who like he babbles and stuff because he's just done meth to the point where his brain is gone, and he's got like a bag where his urine goes, and just you wouldn't want to talk to this guy if you saw him on the street. But to see people look at people eye to eye and make that relational, real life connection, gosh, that's a really powerful and positive example of something that a team can do that you might not see on the surface. You want another one?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Bring another one, and then I want to circle back to that kind of the reverse mission trip kind of thing.
Okay.
Like the PPM dream.
Yeah. So a few years ago, we were working with a pastor, and he was serving out in a very rural part outside of Ensenada, about 45 minutes. And so we were having to drive out there every day, and it was honestly kind of a pain to drive out to the middle of nowhere. But this is a church that was really struggling. And we started noticing when we were doing kids ministry, there were these blue barrels everywhere, these 55-gallon drums, and most of them were empty, but some of them were full of water. And we were like, Pastor, like, what's up with this? And he's like, well, he was kind of ashamed to tell us that his community only got water 2 days a week. He just lived in a place where they didn't have access to water. And what they had to do is, because they only got water 2 days a week, is him and his wife were spending, I think they said like 30 hours a week filling these 55-gallon drums full of water. So even when they got water, it was just like trickling out through a hose. And they were spending 20, 30 hours a week filling these things of water just so their family could survive for cleaning and things like that, flushing the toilets and stuff like that. And I remember our team, they were all like 8th and 9th graders, and they heard this story and their heart just broke. I mean, they were just like, what? So here's this pastor who we love, and he's spending 20 or 30 hours a week, instead of doing ministry, he's filling water barrels for his family. And so I remember one of the kids said, well, what can we do? And the pastor's like, well, we could never afford it, but there's this tank that we could put on top of our house, and it would store like 300 gallons of water, and it's all automatic, and we could hook it up to the water. So when the water runs, it fills this tank when we don't have water. And we were like, oh, wow, well, let's pray about that. And then one of the kids was like, well, how much does it cost? And we found out that the whole thing was like $300. But this $300 that he didn't have, it was just an impossible amount of money for him to even think about. And the kids, I mean, like 8th and 9th graders, they go to their backpacks and they're just like pulling out 20s, and they're just handing that. They're like, we got $300 right now. Let's do this. And so we took a couple of the kids and we went and bought the tank. And it was just so powerful because their heart was in the right place. They're like, we want the pastor to be able to do more ministry and not just fill these water tanks. We're not just giving him a gift. We're freeing him up to do the ministry that God's called him to. And I strapped that giant plastic tank to the top of my like 2005 Toyota Sienna, and we drove like 30 miles out in the country, and we were able to deliver that tank to that family. And the look on his face, because we did it as a surprise, was just stunning. I mean, he was just like floored. He's like, these girls are like 14 years old, and they just changed this guy's life, right? So something as simple as that, for them, their parents all sent them with, every kid had $40 in their wallet, for souvenirs or whatever. But those girls who were already on a mission trip were like, no, we want to make a huge, we want to make a bigger impact. And so it's stuff like that. That's why you do short-term missions. That, yes, you left an impact in Ensenada, but those girls even took home like, hey, when we work together, we could do amazing things, not just out of the kindness of our heart, but we could do amazing things for ministry that make a huge impact in our community. Those are the things that really get me excited.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Hey, talk. We've got another question, but I want you to hold that question, Jonathan, because we got a couple extra minutes here before we hit the curve. Let's not talk language, right? I know a lot of groups are afraid of the language barrier and trying to know with that. And I know I've got some thoughts on that and some good stories on that side of things. But I'd love to hear your perspective on going somewhere where maybe you really nobody in your team knows how to speak Creole or Spanish or whatever else. Yeah,
I remember the very first time I went to Haiti and I experienced Haitian Creole. I was like, what is this? Like, it's a very challenging language. You're like, I recognize that from French, but like, what is all this other stuff? I think it's one of those things that it's a mentality, but you have to see it also as an opportunity for someone else to serve. And so, there are amazing gifted with the ability of languages. And so I'll give it on two things. One is the people that do interpretation are there to minister. And I think that's something that teams oftentimes don't see, is that the reason that, when we're out hiring somebody to be a what we call an assistant trip leader, or they're basically they're translating for our teams. I'm looking for somebody who's prepared to do ministry, not just in the community, but also to the people who are coming. It's not unusual for me to see that interpreter form a relationship with our students in an appropriate way, of course, and to really go after it and say, where do you need to grow in your life? And they're like really pouring into those kids. But as far as the language barrier itself goes, I think it's one of those. It's an opportunity for you to express some humility if you really don't speak a language at all, and to be able to learn how to speak through somebody is just a skill. And so sometimes it can be really a benefit to you to have an interpreter in a lot of different perspectives. But I've seen so many amazing connections happening through our interpretation that it really is not that big of a barrier. I think it's a little bit awkward just because you've never experienced it before. But it's one of those things, once you've experienced and you realize, like, actually what this person is doing is helping me express my true feelings and my true words as opposed to word for word translation, then it actually becomes quite helpful. There's so much beyond just language that goes into having a conversation. It's about culture. It's about, even the way that you present yourself. A good portion of your communication is simply your own gestures and your posture and stuff like that, those nonverbals. That's almost what communicates better than anything. And then, I think if you let a language be the barrier in a relationship, you're really missing out. I know, like, I have the opportunity to take one of my kids goes on a lot of our trips. He doesn't speak any Spanish at all, but he's got really good friends that don't speak any English at all. And I have no idea how they talk, but they talk and they figure it out, and they kind of get past that stuff. They do a lot of pantomiming and pointing and whatever. But it's one of those things that if you allow it to be a barrier, it's going to be a barrier. But if you use the tools that are around you, we just don't see it being a huge problem on our trips.
My first trip back in with PPM in Costa Rica back in 2012, our team did a ton of language prep. We did a ton of working on phrases and different things and all the stuff that went along with that. And I remember going thinking like I had some tools and some things in my bag. And I remember I'd be sitting with somebody trying to have a conversation with them, and I would be spending the whole time in my head trying to figure out how I was going to say whatever I was going to say next, and I wasn't listening. And it dawned on me about halfway through the trip that I was so in my head trying to figure out how to try to speak their language that the next year I did zero language prep. And languages don't come easy for me. And so by doing zero language prep, I was so more focused on the conversation at hand. Who was I making eye contact with when the conversation? Was I making eye contact with the translator? Was I making eye contact with the person I was speaking to? And all those things. And I found that I'm a better listener. I'm a better posture when I'm relying on somebody to help me make that relationship happen. And I know, super thankful for Adriana and Joe who were with me last week, but I know that there's just so much power in having to rely on someone. We joke, Adam, about when you get the chance to speak in front of the church and you actually give a couple extra minutes to think about what you're going to say next in English, because they're translating. And if you say it wrong and the church all laughs, it means the translator just decided to go in a different direction anyway, which was probably better suited for the moment. But
I mean, I speak what I describe as toddler level Spanish, and so like I haven't gotten brave enough. Tim saw me preach a couple weeks ago at his church partner in Ensenada, and it is totally true. You could be preaching, and you're basically one phrase ahead of. You're like, I kind of have an idea where this is going, but I have to wait for, so it gives you that opportunity to think a little bit. So it definitely be to your advantage. I always do want to encourage people who are going on trips. Hey, jump on Duolingo. Jump on, any little language that you can learn is going to help, even if it's just. Good morning, goodbye, God bless you, so on and so forth. All that stuff is always appreciated. I always encourage people like, hey, I know some of you were taking Spanish in high school. Just let it fly. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about making mistakes. If you make a mistake and it's really bad, we'll probably laugh. But we're not laughing at you. It's because we've all made those mistakes too. I know in Mexico, there's a lot of innuendo. And so sometimes you think you're translating something like literally that's going to be okay. And then you just told somebody something like that they're really sexy or something like that. That's always fun. So those are just relational opportunities. Everybody knows you're a language learner, and, you didn't mean to, I remember I confused, I was trying to tell somebody they were a really good cook, and instead I told them they were really like a pigsty, like they were really like a really messy person, and and it was just an opportunity for us to share a laugh. They're like, I know what you meant, but you just called me like really dirty. So, yeah. All
right, two questions to close us out. Both dealing with kind of like what's next, like where do we decide where to go and serve? And then the question that we'll follow with, because I think everybody is kind of really curious about this, is like, is it safe now? Is it, can we go now? And so how about we tackle the first one first? How do we decide, where to go and serve? How did Tim end up in Ensenada? How did I end up in Haiti? How did other groups decide where they go to, where do you even begin when you're looking for a longtime partner?
Yeah, so I think some of it starts with that strategy of really thinking about what am I trying to accomplish? Am I trying to do something where that's English speaking? So that's where domestic trips are fantastic. I had an opportunity to lead a domestic trip about 2 months ago, and I had no idea that because of COVID, all of these organizations that depend on volunteers are not getting volunteering now. And so, we showed up. They were like, "You brought 20 people to help? Are you kidding me? This is the biggest blessing we've received in 6 months." And so, when you think about your strategy, I think your first question is domestically or internationally? Are you trying to do something that you can drive to? Are you trying to do something that's a cheap flight? Those are all part of, when you think of it even as a long-term strategy, is that going to be a place that we can get to in an affordable way? And so that's where the domestic trips and even some international locations really come into play. And so, because it has to be part of you're saying, I'm going to make an investment of 3 to 5 years in going to this specific location, then you have to think first domestically or internationally. What's actually affordable for people in my church to go to so that they can know about that. Like I said, I'm a parent of high school kids, and it's sexy when the church sends home that flyer. It says this mission trip's going to be like $1,800, and then I look at my wife like, well, where's $1,800 going to come from? Like how are we? And then you start talking about how church wants to do that every year. It's like, well, maybe we could do that for senior year, but we can't afford to do that every year. So those are the things that you realistically have to start thinking about as far as what is your strategy. The other thing is, where's your heart? Sometimes, and I'm all about it. Like, let's say that you just the pastor or the youth pastor of the church has a heart for a specific area of the country, and they want to make an investment in domestically or internationally. I think that's an important thing for something being longitudinal. Is, do you really have a heart for that community? If you're in Philly and you have people that just have a heart for going to Appalachia, then awesome, make that long-term investment, even though it's a 6-hour drive. It's not, that really cool flight to flying into Port-au-Prince and all those crazy things. I think that's a secondary thing to that. And I think the third thing is just what's realistic. We don't ever want to see somebody sign up for a trip that they can't possibly pull off. Yes, it's awesome, and yes, we do like we have ministries in Israel right now. We have ministries that are happening in South Africa, but for a church that's never been on a trip before, or maybe economically it's not really feasible, that $2,000 or $3,000 flight, because you do group travel, is going to be a little bit more expensive than what you see, listed for a regular flight. It might not be a realistic. So it's got to be a realistic place for you to go for the long term when you think about going back every year or every other year. Does that help?
That was huge. Those three hit it. At a PPM, how do you help people with those strategies and make those decisions happen? How do you guys do it?
I mean, we have those exact same conversations. When we're trying to, ultimately what we want to see is teams that we don't want them to be overstressed by their trip, right? So we know it's really challenging, because a lot of us have been in youth work before. We know it's really challenging when you look at that, the fundraising aspect on your side, saying like, okay, so now we're going to take 18 kids on this trip and it's $2,000 each. Like, so now you're a youth pastor, how are you going to raise $36,000, to pull that trip off? We know that that's a challenge. And so, we want to have those conversations early. For some churches, they budget, churches say, hey, we invest $10,000 or $20,000 a year in short-term missions, and so we're going to subsidize those trips from our budget. Then that makes it a little bit more realistic. But we just have those conversations early on like what is actually realistic for your church to go, and not just go once, but to hopefully go more than once. It's a phrase that one of our pastors in Haiti said early on in our ministry, was like, to come to Haiti once is great, to come to Haiti twice is better. And so to have those relationships, becomes an important thing. But that's where we have a whole group of consultants. That's part of what happens in PPM world. After you sign up for a trip, you get assigned to a consultant that really gets to know your team, gets to know your church and your heart and your vision, and that strategy and how a trip can fit into that. And it's not unusual for our consultants to say, hey, what you're planning is probably not realistic. Let's try to find a location that's more realistic, that better fits your strategy over here, because they have a little bit broader scope of all of our ministries.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Those are really, really good, wise words. Not biting off more than you can do, and being able to go back a second time is far more important, especially for me and my benefit. And being able to take one of the other things that I look for when I look for a location is one that I can not just take my students, but one that I'm going to be able to get adults to invest into. A ministry in our church that stops and ends with the student ministry is only going to go so far. But we were at our best in Haiti when I was taking adults in the fall, and then my seniors to back it up over spring break, and that kind of a double trip was really, really powerful with how strong our bond was in that community, because they were used to me showing up twice a year. And that was really, really special.
Yeah, that's where that long-termness comes into it, so like you and I, we sat down with your partner a couple weeks ago, and we, I just said, Pastor, what are your dreams for your church? And one of his dreams was sending his teenagers on a mission trip. And I was like, man, wouldn't it be cool, Tim, if you and the youth group from this group went on a mission trip together? Like, wow, that'd be incredible. Or what would it be like to have Pastor Manuel come and preach at your church because you have a long-term partnership? Or wouldn't it be cool if you had a group of nurses that came down and did a clinic here in this community, and those kinds of things? When you start seeing like all those ideas pop up and they start going two ways between your partner and the church in the States, like it's pretty magical. And it gets it out of that silo of youth ministry. That's what you're talking about, is how do I get it past just the youth group trip? But this is a church's investment in this community to have a real partnership. That's what it's going to take. Right? So,
and to have the youth lead that out in your church is so important for them to see, for the next generation, that whole concept that they are the church of today, not the church of tomorrow. That they are living and breathing that out by leading in this way and encouraging, standing in front of the church and saying, "Hey, I went. It's your turn next, adults. Let's see what do you do out there."
Cool. So let's talk COVID.
Let's talk COVID. We got 5 minutes left. Let's talk COVID. Is it safe?
It's getting safer and safer every day. Here at PPM, from the very beginning, we said we're going to find a way. And so even last summer, we had a scattering of trips that went out last summer to places to serve where it was possible. And so we as an organization said, we're not ever going to shut down. Like, that's not who we are. Our mission is dangerous. Our ministry risk is part of what we do. We can mitigate those risks. But I don't want to work for a mission organization that's not willing to take some level of risk. That's just who I am in my relationship with Jesus. I live out Romans 12:1 and 2 every day. I'm walking dead. I'm living as a personal sacrifice. At the same time, when you're taking people's children, you have to mitigate all those things, right? Because it's a little bit different thing. Adam and Tim going somewhere versus Tim bringing his kids or the teenagers of his church. So is it safe right now? There are places to go where you can totally travel in a way where we can mitigate the risk. We've had teams out right now, even just during spring break. I think we had like 800 people out serving. We did not have a single team outbreak. We've had a scattering of positive tests after trips, but they've been pretty far and few between. We do a lot to mitigate the impact of COVID on our teams. We ask our teams to test in advance of the trip, to kind of travel as a pod. All the mask requirements that are in play in our various locations. We follow all that stuff. We take care of sanitation, so on and so forth. We've been finding ways to continue to do ministry because it's important. It's important to continue supporting these churches. It's important to keep, going forward in our faith. I was saying, how can God use me during a time of COVID? That's beyond just me sitting at home and staying safe. There's things that you and I should be doing in our communities. I've been, recognizing that amongst myself. Like I've been struggling with getting out and serving in my community because it felt too dangerous, and going, well, is that really who I am? It's not who I want to be. And so finding ways to do that in a way that's safe is super important. So yeah, I think that the worst of it's past as far as like our, as far as short-term missions goes. We're going to have close to 9,000 people out serving this year. So it's not a normal year for us. Is more like 12 to 14, that range. So it's not as much as we've had in the past. We have a good number of people that have looked at our COVID protocols and said, yep, that's going to do fine for us. We as a leadership team, we address those every 30 days and adjust our COVID protocols as we need to. And yeah, we think that is a go time. I mean, I know a lot of people at home. I live in Southern California, where it's been similar to where you're at, right, Tim? Where people have been super careful. I've been in airports. People are traveling like crazy now. People are the vaccine. They're feeling good about it. They've got a little extra money that came in the stimulus, and off they go. But at the same time, we're not seeing numbers go up. We're seeing numbers continue to go down. As the vaccine rollout progresses. Last night I was on a phone call with a youth group that's coming in May, and one of the teenagers asked me, like, should I delay getting my vaccine until after the trip? And I was like, I don't see why you would need to. Go ahead and get that vaccine. If you're, talk to your parents, talk to your doctor, all that stuff. But for our sake, the more people who get vaccinated, the better and more safe it is to travel. And so we're not seeing, because we're taking really good precautions with our teams, we're not seeing any problems emerge. We're certainly testing, we're monitoring, contact tracing, all of those things. It just hasn't borne out that our trips have been problematic at all.
Yeah. The other thing I would add to that, I certainly felt all those things from the PPM side when I was traveling with you last week, but I was super impressed. I did not expect to see as many protocols in place in Mexico as there was. And I was really blown away at how serious that entire community was taking COVID. I saw more masks in Mexico. My hands were forced sanitized. My temperature was checked more. And there were even like these mats that we were scuffing our feet on as we walked into places. I mean, the protocols there actually were significantly higher than they are in my own community here. And I consider us to be a pretty conservatively safe community. So I was very impressed.
Humbly, I would say that Mexico handled the pandemic and took it much more seriously than most places in the United States. Yeah. And what you were seeing was a really tapered down version. I know. There were for a long time when you would go into a convenience store like a 7-Eleven, there'd be a person there taking your temperature, making you do the hand sanitizer, the whole thing, just to go into a 7-Eleven, and then you'd have to do it on the way out. And so that was going on for 6 or 7 months. It was pretty impressive, And so particularly with our international locations, I would say that's going to be the case. Your kids are probably going to be safer there as far as COVID than they are at home. Right. So, just consider that as well. We certainly, if you have if we have folks out there that still want to go, we have availability for trips in August and the fall. We would love to host them in places like Jackson and Appalachia and stuff like that. We have plenty of availability in the fall for that.
Awesome. All right, Adam, how do people get a hold of you? What's you want to drop some social there? Jonathan may already have it queued. He does. I'm sure he does. He's the man. Jonathan, thanks for hosting us today. This conversation, this chat. You guys don't know Jonathan. He's with the OC Tabernacle, Ocean City, Jersey. He's also looking to host you and connect with you on the Jersey Shore this summer and beyond. I really enjoyed being with you guys today. You can certainly find me on the Epic Facebook or on any of those groups. Happy to talk missions. Happy to talk about some of my story and some of my history that we didn't get into today. Final thoughts from you, Adam, as we close out?
Well, no, I really thank you for asking these really good questions because, it's super important to understand how short-term missions can fit into your overall ministry. I think all too often people are, they put it into a box of like, it's this thing we do in the summer and it doesn't really impact our ministry day to day, or we use it just for outreach. We use it as an excuse like, hey, you have to be, involved so much to go on our mission trip. The more you integrate short-term missions into your overall strategy, not just in your student ministry, but your church-wide, you want to talk about blowing up people's lives, start taking families on mission trips. That's been the biggest thing we've seen lately is the whole family coming and serving together. It's an incredible way to just reignite the faith of a family is to invest in something like that. So the more you integrate short-term missions into your overall church strategy, the more impact that you'll see both in your own church community, but also where you're serving. So we look forward to at PPM serving you guys. Our vision is big. We're currently serving 450 partners. Our vision is to serve 1,500 partners by the year 2030, and that's the marching orders that we're on. So we look forward to working with you guys more and more.
All right, man. That's good.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody. We enjoyed having you with us today. Certainly reach out if you've got questions. See you later.
Talk to you later.